Charles V, or Carlos Quinto, as it says here right in the right. See in the bottom, it says Carlos Quinto. That's from an old painting from Peru. It's in the Lima, in the Larco Museum in Lima, Peru. And right next to him is the Inca Kings. All right. And they're also the same complexion as him. All right. So Carlos Quinto, which is in Spanish, Charles V, Carlos Quinto. All right. This is him over here too, with his regalia, his Vatican Holy Roman Emperor regalia. This is not slave clothing. This is how you know it's him. These emblems, historians know what this means. You know, they just keep it in the hush. We know how to dodge the hijack. We know Carlos Quinto was the Swarthy Man. Carlos Quinto, we're going to hear today what he was doing, what else he was doing to the American indigenous people here. All right, a more on more war. Yeah, it's deep like that. It's deep like that. It wasn't just about white people. All right. So again, and we're also trying to correct history regarding who was really being put under slavery. All right. So I wanted to begin with this book real quick, just to correlate on another book we're going to read. It says here, World's Columbian Exposition at Chicago. The Venezuela Ministerio de Relaciones, or the Ministry of Relations, of Exterior Relations from Venezuela. Again, World's Columbian Exposition at Chicago, the United States of Venezuela in 1893. This is the name of the book. We're going to go to page 96. And it says here, I guess chapter 3, Slave Hunters in Maracapana. Now remember, I did a video about the origin of the name America. We had that word here already. When the Spanish got here, there was actually a place called Amaraca or Amaruca, that the indigenous population had towns and cities named like that, Amaraca, in South America on the coast there. All right, so this is part of it, Macarapana, infamous traffic, the infamous traffic of the so-called Indians, development of New Cadiz. Remember, New Cadiz was the colony of Columbus' son. Right, so we're going to get into this part of the book. This is actually a coat of arms they found in the water. There was a big earthquake there in 1543 that destroyed New Cadiz. It was actually erased from history, New Cadiz. And this is actually Charles V's coat of arms. This is famous. They found it there in the water and off the coast after the earthquake. You know, after hundreds of years, they found it. All right, and it was Charles V. Now we're going to read again what Charles V was doing to the indigenous population here. Now it says down here, the royal audience wished by this means to acquire correct information concerning the war with the natives. In case hostilities were decided, the commissioners were to sign a report to the effect which was to be forwarded to the sovereign, who would then give orders to pursue the Indians as rebels. All right, they're declaring war on the indigenous population. It would have been impossible to enact a measure more favorable to the slave dealers, for the result would infallibly be war. No regular war declaration, however, was required to hunt down the Indians. The produce of the oyster fisheries had fallen off so much in 1534 that the dealers had to seek some other branch of trade in order to obtain the same profit as formerly. All right, so because remember, they had the indigenous population getting the pearls, they were running out. You know, and so what they turned to, they started turning into slavery, right? They were using that as the trade. So they were needing, free laborers or so-called slaves, and that was the indigenous population they were going to use. And because of how they enslaved so many populations, destroyed so many lives there, it says here, this revenge of populations suffering from pillage, devastation, and the reduction to slavery of parents and children was but just and logical, yet it induced the government to take measures which only increased the evil. In consequence of an act of piracy committed by Carib Indians on the coast of Margarita in 1535, The king again decreed that the Caribs, again, who was the Caribs? I just showed you guys the pictures, right? The images. Who was the Caribs? Should be reduced to bondage. Remember, return to Egypt or bondage. Egypt, bondage, return to bondage. They were to be considered as slaves, just as such, and marked if a marking iron was available. An annual report of the number of slaves marked was to be forwarded to the home government. All right. They're talking about iron, putting iron on people, right? Branding them, right? Marked with an iron if it was available, and sending the numbers to the home government, who was again Charles V, right? Holy Roman Emperor Carlos V, aka Charles V. All right. Let's go back. Says here, the zone of the pearl fisheries was extended, and fresh Spanish and Italian adventurers were to prey on the wealth extracted from the mollusk, which during centuries had quietly rested beneath the waters. Cubagua was on the wane. Its pearl deposits were disappearing because the Indians, urged by the insatiable cupidity of the conquistadors, had ended by extirpating them, but there were still natives remaining on their athletic shoulders, on the tender arms of their children. The burning iron inscribed the deed of property according to the sentence passed by legal cupidity. All right, they were being branded. This was the state of things in Cubagua when Benzoni visited the island in 1542. We're going to get Benzoni's account right now in a different book, all right, because it's more detailed than this little paragraph right here. So we're going to get his account soon, but this is what he encountered. They're saying when he arrived there in 1542, the indigenous population being treated very cruelty and put under slavery. Indians, not so-called Africans, all right? Before we go on to Benzoni, I just want to read to you what Bartolomeo de las Casas had to say about the fisheries and these pearl divers, right? What they were doing to them. Now listen to this. This is very crazy. Let me see if I can zoom in. And it says, this horrible description does not stand alone. Here's the heart-trending narrative of Bartolomeo de las Casas. Hardly had the Indian pearl fisheries issued from the water with a supply of oysters when their masters forced them to dive again without allowing them to recruit their strength and draw breath. They were like, no, go back down. They were making them go back down when they hadn't even catch their breath. If through sheer necessity the Indian remained above water a few minutes, the master whipped, all right, obliged him to dive again. Nearly all the slaves thus employed died in a short time. They were fed on the remains of oysters. Occasionally, they got some cassava bread, but they never received any wine or strengthening liquor to restore their weakened bodies, which had become covered with scales through the continual contact of salt water. So these people got scales in their skin now. At night, these poor creatures were confined in stocks and loaded with chains so as to procure any possibility of escaping. At dawn, their dreary round of work again began. Many disappeared, devoured by sharks. Others would faint away or vomit blood. Most of them died of hunger, cruel treatment, and despair. All right, that's from Bartolomeo de las Casas' primary source. This is a picture unequaled by any of Dante's Inferno. Human beings like unto spectres, covered with scales, with shoulders furrowed by the whip, ulcerated, dying of hunger, alternately plunging into the rising from the waters, bearing to their implacable tormentors the prices they had wrested from the bosom of the seas. And again, who are we talking about? Again, these are some Caribs, right? These are some other Caribs right here. All right, more Caribs. Who are we talking about when they're talking about, doing this to people? So-called Indians. All right, Carib woman right here. All right, Caribs from St. Vincent down here. More Caribs from Dominica. Who's the Caribs, right? And again, who else were they using? Who did they send to dive? Right? Lucayans, right? Lucayans, dark-skinned people, Lucayans. They were the ones. So Caribs and Lucayans and Arawaks, any people that were there, and any other populations that were being used, even from Panama, even from North America, as so-called slaves, even from Peru, even from other parts like Brazil, they were bringing them there, and that's who they were using. And these are the people that they were just describing with scales and all that bad treatment. This infamous and never-ending traffic, this continual assassination of defenseless populations, which were to disappear like the inhabitants of Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, this holocaust of victims of the lash, slavery, hunger, and want of sleep did not satisfy the greed of the conquistadors. Again, who's these conquistadors? The oyster beds and the inhabitants of the Venezuelan shores and islands had ceased to exist. The last of the natives had witnessed his sisters dishonored and his family ruthlessly sacrificed. And that's what I wanted to show you, read to you, this account from Bartolomeo de las Casas regarding and correlating what we read about, right? Learned about the pearls, right? And how they were using the American Indians, right? Eventually in history, they became so-called just slaves or blacks, right? Or so-called Africans, right? But they were indigenous populations, all right? So now we're going to go to another book. Again, we're going to get Benzoni's version of what he saw when he got there. We just got De las Casas, primary source. Now we're going to get another primary source, Benzoni. And with the book, which is called Spanish and Portuguese South America During the Colonial Period by Robert Grant Watson. It says editor of Murray's Handbook of Greece, 4th edition, and also author of a book called The History of Persia. So he's very popular and with these historical books, right? A scholarly source. The Italian traveler Benzoni, who had been referred to in the preceding pages, has been quoted by Robertson, Irvin, and Helps, but considering the unique position which he holds as being the first foreign critic of the proceedings of the Spaniards in South America, I scarcely think that his volume has received the full attention which it deserves at the hands of modern writers on Spanish South America. I would therefore draw attention to some extracts from his work, begging the reader to bear in mind that they proceed by no means from a man of the mold of Las Casas, but from one who, by his own confession, took part in a slave hunting expedition. All right, so they're saying, all right, we're going to read this account from this person. He ain't no angel like Las Casas. That's what they're saying. He actually was a slaver. All right, it says the author in question was nevertheless, as he states, a devout Christian. So even though he was enslaving American Indians, because that's what we're talking about here, not Africans, the author in question, it says, was nevertheless a devout Christian. And he dedicates his history of the New World to Pope Pius the Fourth. All right, so it says Benzoni, all right, remember the slaver, started for America in the year 1541, and there spent 14 years of toil and travail, landing at the Gulf of Paria. All right, this is in South America, I believe, close to Venezuela, or in Venezuela today. He proceeded to Cuba and other islands, returning thence to Acla. When he crossed to Panama, from which place he visited the kingdom of Peru. The kingdom of Peru. In this wandering course, he passed 14 years. Benzoni is the author who is originally responsible for the well-known story of Columbus and the egg. He states that whilst at Amaracapana, all right, let me take that off so you can see that. Amaracapana. All right, so let's zoom in a little bit. It's a little better, right? I want you guys to see this. So, Amaracapana. So while he was at Amaracapana, this is in South America, it says, he states that whilst at Amaracapana, Captain Callis arrived with upwards of 4,000 slaves, 4,000 slaves, and had captured many more. When some of them could not walk, the Spaniards, to prevent their remaining behind to make war, killed them by burying their swords in their sides of their breast. So when they couldn't survive these slaves they had, they would just kill them so they wouldn't, make delays or stay behind or anything like that. All right. It was really a most distressing thing to see the way in which these wretched creatures, naked, tired, and lame, were treated, exhausted with hunger, sick and despairing. The unfortunate mothers, with 2 and 3 children on their shoulders or clinging around their necks, overwhelmed with tears and grief, all tied with cords or with iron chains around their necks, or their arms or their hands. Nor was there a girl but had been violated by the depredators. Oh man, they were even violating girls.
At page 159, Benzoni observes that Spaniards have eulogized themselves too much when they tell us that they are worthy of great praise for having converted to Christianity the tribes and nations that they subjugated. All right, so we're talking about these tribes and nations. All right, for there is great difference between the name and the being one in reality. All right, so even though they were bolstering themselves, talking about we were evangelizing them and making them civilized and Christian, all right, they were covering that, the cruelties, atrocities that they were committing. All right, with that, it says the slaves, all right, this is quotes, somebody saying this, all right, it says the slaves are all marked in the face and on the arms by a hot iron with the mark of C. Then the governors and captains do as they like with them. Some are given to the soldiers, so that the Spaniards afterwards sell them or gamble them away amongst each other. When ships arrive from Spain, they barter these Indians for wine. Who? The Indians. All right. So let's go back. All right. I want you to understand what's going on here. All right. Because it says that Benzoni, right? Remember? He arrived at where? At Amaracapana. There was already a place called Amaracapana in South America. All right. He arrived with what? With 4,000 slaves, it says, right? Now we go back. Who were these slaves? These were Indians, right? So when ships would arrive there, what they would do from Spain, they would barter these Indians for wine, flour, biscuit, and other requisite things. And even when some of the Indian women are pregnant by the same Spaniards, they sell them without any conscience. Then the merchants carry them elsewhere. They take them to the other side, reverse, and sell them again, Others are sent to the island of Hispaniola. All right, so once they leave their mainland, their indigenous land, and they travel to these other places, right? These servants and slaves that they capture, these indigenous people, they put in captivity, prisoners of war. They would call them Negroes from there. You understand? Filling with them some large vessels built like caravels. All right, filling the vessels, right? Filling with what? With Indians, not Africans, Indians, and supplying what? Hispaniola. All right, so it says they carry them under the deck, and being nearly all people captured inland, they suffer severely the sea horrors. And not being allowed to move out of those sinks, what with their sickness and their other ones, they have to stand in the filth like animals. And the sea often being calm, water and other provisions fail them, so that the poor wretches, oppressed by the heat, the stench, the thirst, and the crowded, miserably expire there below. All right, we're talking about American Indians that are experiencing this cruelty. All right, we're talking about Deuteronomy 28. And, but you see how this correlates with what we're learning in the other series, right? Who was getting enslaved by the Spanish? The Indians, right? It's another account right here, letting you know straight up. Look what they went through in these ships. Now, all that country around the Gulf of Paria and other places are no longer inhabited by Spaniards. Finally, out of the 2 million of original inhabitants of Hispaniola, through the number of suicides and other deaths occasioned by the oppressive labor and cruelties imposed by the Spaniards, there are not 150 now to be found. And this has been their way of making Christians out of them. What befell these poor islanders has happened also to all the others around. Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and other places. And although an almost infinite number of the inhabitants of the mainland have been brought to these islands as slaves, they have nearly all since died. And it says, the initial letter of the Emperor Charles V. All right. So who was saying this? Who was describing this? Charles V. And what were they putting on their face and in their arms? With a hard iron, a mark of C for Charles V. C for Charles V. Charles V. Do you understand what he looked like? He was another brother, colored, so-called Negro. This is just another more on more war. All right.